The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.
Lee. Mike Lee is a friend of mine and one of the really good guys in Congress. He is, I personally believe, and I have nothing to back this up, so Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but I personally believe that it's almost good cop, bad cop with him and Cruz. Cruz will go out and he'll be, and you can walk in and like, Ted's got a twitchy eye today, man. I would deal with me before you have Ted. But Senator Mike Lee is a guy who knows the Constitution inside and out and is a fierce opponent of anybody who stands against it. And welcome to the program, Mike. How are you?
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
Okay, so, Senator, you sound so senatorial. We were talking last week. You were in New York, or you were in. I was in Washington, and we were speaking last week about universal health care and the caving of John Roberts. And you have actually been working on this, and you say you can lay out a case that he was not through the NSA, but intimidated and changed his vote.
Well, yeah. So, in my book, Why John Roberts Was Wrong About Health Care, I explain what the Supreme Court did when it upheld this law, even after finding that it exceeded Congress's authority under the Constitution. The Supreme Court rewrote it in order to save it. Rewrote it not just once, but twice. And as I point out in the book, there are a lot of indications that Chief Justice Roberts may well have taken a different approach right after oral argument, but then changed his position. And it just so happens that it was during that same period of time between the oral argument and the time that the court issued the opinion on June 28th of last year that there was a real campaign of intimidation by a lot of Democrats in this town, a lot of Democrats in the Senate, and also by the White House, publicly making statements to the effect that, this is going to diminish John Roberts' legacy as Chief Justice if he invalidates this holy act, this great act of Congress that was enacted by a duly elected Congress. And at some point, it appears that may have gotten to him, and he caved, and it looks like he switched his vote. There are a lot of indications to that effect that I explain in the book.
Okay, give me a couple of them, the indications where.
Okay, first of all, the mere fact that the dissenting opinion was written in many respects in the language of a majority opinion itself suggests to me that originally Chief Justice Roberts was going to be part of that, what would have been a majority opinion. It doesn't sound like a dissent. It refutes the arguments put forward by the government more than it does direct itself primarily toward refuting the arguments of the opinion of the court.
You were, hang on just a second. You were a clerk at the Supreme Court, were you not?
Yes, sir. I clerked for Justice Alito.
Okay.
And so I'm familiar with the way these things operate, and these opinions tend to percolate for weeks or months following oral argument. There are drafts that go back and forth. So the opinion itself was written in such a way to suggest that he switched his vote. There was also a great article, a piece written by Jan Crawford of ABC News, who claimed to have had inside sources in the Supreme Court, which are very hard to get, suggesting that is, in fact, exactly what happened. And then, meanwhile, this occurs at exactly the same time that you have people like my friend and colleague Pat Leahy, Democratic senator from Vermont, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He took to the floor at about the same time when it's alleged that he may have switched his vote, specifically talking about how the court has no business being activist and invalidating this duly enacted act of Congress. There was a heavy campaign designed to, I think, suggest to Chief Justice Roberts that he should just shy away from invalidating it. In any event, that's what happened. He shied away from it, and he rewrote it in order to save it.
There were a lot of people that said, "Oh, look at how great this is. He's coming across the aisle."
Yes, and I specifically addressed that point in Why John Roberts Was Wrong about health care. And what I explain is that there is no aisle in the Supreme Court. There is no aisle on that bench, either literally or figuratively. The significance of whether you are appointed by a Republican or a Democrat becomes completely irrelevant once you're confirmed by the Senate. And so there's no reaching across the aisle. This isn't a show of magnanimity that you're going to work with people supposedly of the other party. There is no party structure in the court. And in fact, if a jurist were to do that and were to go against his or her own views about how that case should be decided based on the law and facts before the court, that would be a betrayal of the judicial oath. And so what I do and why John Roberts was wrong about health care is to try to debunk systematically these arguments that suggest that this may have just been a brilliant move by John Roberts to try to preserve his reputation as Chief Justice, because it's not about reputation. It's about the right answer under the law. The right answer under the law was not to rewrite this thing in order to save it.
When you say rewrite it, one of the ways he rewrote the law was essentially to say it was a tax even though it was not a tax as written in the law, correct? Because it never would have passed if they were promoting it as a tax in the first place.
Exactly. And as I point out in the book, they tried to pass it as a tax initially. An earlier version of it was written as a tax. But not surprisingly, that couldn't get enough votes. Even in a democratically controlled House and Senate, they didn't have enough votes to do that because it was understandably unpopular. That's when they switched it to a penalty. And so Congress had to write it as a penalty, and under 100 years' worth of jurisprudential
So then how did it pass?
It
Mike, how did it pass then? Because it was so clearly not a tax. How did they get around the facts of that? I know that's what the White House argued. Well, yes, it is a tax. But that's not what they argued to the American people and not what they argued in Congress. So how did he make this jump in his head?
Well, it was difficult. It required a difficult act of legal gymnastics. And as I explained in Why John Roberts Was Wrong About Healthcare, what he did was to say, I know this appears to be a penalty. And in fact, he found that it was a penalty and not a tax for purposes of the Anti-Injunction Act, which, had they reached the opposite conclusion, would have said the court couldn't even address this case right now, probably for another 2 years after that. So they found that it was a penalty for some purposes and not a tax. But when they got to the constitutional analysis, they said, oh, well, we think it's a tax. And the reason there was they said it would be unconstitutional if we didn't find that it was a tax, so we're going to find it a tax because we think that is a fairly possible reading of the statute.
Mike,
the problem is it wasn't,
Mike,
and he was wrong.
Let me ask you this. I believe in the Constitution. I believe in the Union. I believe in America, and I believe that we need to be a country that can come together with many diverse points and many diverse ideas. If you want to have universal health care and pay for everything from universal birth to universal death, and you want to do that in your own state, that's fine. You have a right to do that. We are now marching down a road where we are state by state being asked to commit suicide. And I don't believe that the Constitution, it doesn't make sense that the Constitution would be a suicide pact. How do states that say, guys, I love you and I want to be a part of the Union, but I will not go down these roads because it's going to kill all of us, and somebody has to preserve the Union. Somebody has to preserve freedom. How is there not a right to be able to preserve yourself?
There is a right, and that right is protected by a number of structures within the Constitution. As I explained in Why John Roberts Was Wrong About Healthcare, I think the two most important structures built in the Constitution that will protect you, protect exactly what you were just describing, Glenn, was the separation of powers. First, the separation of powers along the horizontal axis within the federal government divides legislative power from executive power, from judicial power. And also the separation of powers along the vertical axis between the federal government on the one hand and states and local governments on the other hand. If we followed those, as the Constitution contemplated we would have the kind of society that you described, Glenn, where people in Vermont, if they wanted to, could have a single-payer, government-funded, government-run healthcare system. They could knock themselves out. I would never, ever live in Vermont for that reason, but they could do it. we would have a kind of society where people could get more of the government that they want and less of the
But is there any chance of us actually getting back to that without some sort of craziness, of the 1860s? Is there any way? I mean, the progressives, one of the first things they did was they made sure that your job went into the election instead of being beholden to the state legislature. You are now beholden to an election, which totally changed the ballot. Now you're a federal guy, and so now it matters. I mean, being able to repeal even that, is there a way to do this, or do we just end some horrible fiery plane crash here?
Yes, there is a way to do it, and that's why this is ultimately a message of hope. There is a way to do it, and it's through the electoral process. And sure, there are things that have made it more difficult, but increasingly, as I talk to people from throughout my state and across the country, people are naturally drawn, they're naturally receptive to the argument of federalism and separation of powers. The more this becomes a mainstream political argument, the more it's going to sell. And as it sells, we're going to get to a better place. Because as I explained in this book, one of the main reasons I wrote Why John Roberts Was Wrong About Healthcare is that this is bigger than just healthcare. It's more than just about this one issue. This is about the fact that we've drifted far from separating power between the three branches of the federal government and separating what's state power from federal power. And I explain in this book.
What's the name of it again?
Don't do it. Don't make him say it again. Right,
now, Senator Lee, is the book out? Is it out today? Is it out now?
Yes. It's out.
An
you can buy
ebook,
it
right?
at Amazon or iTunes or anywhere iBooks are sold.
And I'm getting the impression that you think there was indirect pressure on John Roberts to change his mind. You don't think? I mean, it was such a bizarre ruling and so seemingly out of character for him that we suspected maybe there was direct pressure, that maybe they had pictures of him or something.
Or his children or something. I mean, is there?
Did you have any evidence of any of that going on, or is it just completely indirect?
Or are you concerned that with the NSA, any of these kinds of things can be happening or could happen with any of our officials in Washington?
Sure. So as to the first question, no, I don't have any evidence that any of the kinds of things you just described were happening. I have no evidence of that kind of direct pressure. That is not to say there was no direct pressure of any kind, because when you had senators and White House personnel making statements, and even the president himself making statements to the effect that the Supreme Court and the Chief Justice can't allow this to happen. They can't allow a duly enacted act of Congress to be invalidated by a group of unelected judges. They were denigrating the authority of the court. They were implicitly threatening to embarrass the court any way they could in doing that. That doesn't mean that they had pictures or anything else. But as to your broader question about concerns about the NSA, I think these are things that we all need to worry about. We have asked, there have been questions asked of NSA personnel. Did you take efforts to not collect data on Supreme Court justices or on members of Congress just out of respect for separation of powers? And the answer was no. They didn't separate that out. So that data is in there. So somebody, whether it's a day from now, a year from now, or 20 years from now, somebody could, for nefarious purposes, manipulate that data in order to make somebody look bad and in order to achieve a partisan political agenda.
Senator Lee, and we only have like 30 seconds left, but one quick question. Why is it always our guy? I know you said there's no aisle in the Supreme Court, but we put these conservative justices in. We think that they're going to follow the Constitution. It's always our guy who falls away on these big cases. Why is that? It's never Justice Ginsburg who falls away from the liberal side.
The quickest explanation I can give you on that is that the natural gravitational pull in Washington is toward bigger government and is toward the erosion of the separation of powers along the vertical and horizontal axes. That is the natural gravitational pull in this city. The reason we have hope is that the national gravitational pull that the American people feel is in the opposite direction. Momentum is starting to move, and it's moving in our favor. And as I explained in Why John Roberts Was Wrong About Healthcare, we can move it, but we've got to start motivating people to vote differently and to expect more.
Mike, I don't know who you spoke to in some sort of PR firm about making sure you get the name of the book in, but you've done a great job. You should tell your publisher you did a great job. The name of the book again is...
what is it?
Why John Roberts Was Wrong About Healthcare.
And it's an ebook now. Mike, it's always a pleasure, and I am glad that you are in Congress. Senator Mike Lee.
The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.